So the Civil War was a defining event of Hancock's career. It established his reputation as a superb general, arguably the greatest general who never had his own independent command in either the Union or Confederate armies. Nevertheless, his post-war career, while not as defining for him, was very eventful, and also reflected the values, the politics, the personal relationships he had established both before and during the Civil War. Shortly after the war, in 1866, he was appointed a major general in the peacetime army, much reduced in size, nevertheless larger than it had been in the antebellum period. And he was appointed the commander of the military department of the Missouri, which included Colorado, included Kansas, included parts of Missouri, of course. And this is really his first serious taste as a commander in dealing with Native peoples following the war. And in particular, he would have to involve himself in handling the Cheyenne, the Sioux, and the Arapaho. These tribes in particular were very incensed by a important event that happened several years earlier called the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, where a unit of Colorado militiamen slaughtered an Arapaho in Cheyenne village. And so relations, needless to say, were very difficult, and Hancock found himself having to contend with these tribes. Overall, his time in this district was not as distinguished, indeed undistinguished, compared to his career as a general in the Union Army. And it's not terribly surprising in light of his lack of experience, in light of the fact that virtually any commander in the Plains Indians wars had difficulty. It was perhaps punctuated by his dispute with another general under his command, George Armstrong Custer, who Hancock believed was negligent of duty and was not following orders. And in fact, Hancock wanted him court-martialed. Custer responded by publishing 3 rather lengthy articles in New York City newspapers where he attacked Hancock's lack of leadership. Nevertheless, both Ulysses S. Grant, the head of the Army, and William Sherman, the immediate commander of Hancock, stood by him. In fact, Sherman would stand by Hancock repeatedly in the post-war period. But nevertheless, this was a period of his life where he was facing challenges that perhaps he had never really faced in the same way before. Not too long after, in 1867, he was appointed commander of the 5th Military District, which encompassed Louisiana and Texas, and he was appointed by President Andrew Johnson. The 5th Military District was part of a creation of the First Reconstruction Act that was passed by Congress. It was vetoed, the act was vetoed by Johnson, and the veto was overridden. And this is what we call part of what sometimes historians have called military reconstruction or radical reconstruction, where Republicans, led by the radical wing of the party that the radical wing wanting to secure the rights of the freedmen following the Civil War, wanted to wholly reconstruct Southern society. In order to do so, they felt the Army had to ensure the fact that African Americans could register to vote, could serve on juries, and have their civil rights protected. Andrew Johnson, despite opposing this legislation, of course, had to live with it, and he appointed Hancock as commander in Louisiana and Texas. And this gave Hancock, of course, a great deal of power. Now, Hancock himself appears not to have actually wanted the position. Of course, he followed his orders, but his arrival in Louisiana was hailed by particular Southern white Democrats as a positive change from the previous commander, Philip Sheridan, who was perceived by many in the white community as overly involved and supportive of radical Reconstruction, and quote, partisan in the language of these Southern whites. Upon assuming command in Louisiana, Hancock issued a very important and controversial order called General Order Number 40, which, among other things, declared, and I will quote, "And the civil authorities are ready and willing to perform their duties. The military power should cease to lead, and the civil administration resume its natural and rightful dominion." What he is essentially saying is the U.S. military will pull back and let civil authorities in places like Louisiana and Texas assume a larger role. This order immediately put him on the side of Southern white conservatives in the region, who viewed this as a welcome change from the federal forces intervening in ways they opposed. And shortly in his tenure as district commander, Hancock also reversed a number of decisions and orders that Sheridan had implemented. For example, he countermanded an order that prevented the state legislature from preventing African Americans to serve on juries. He also countermanded a decision that Sheridan had issued, which made it easier for African Americans to register to vote and more difficult for ex-Confederates to vote. Once again, these decisions that Hancock made were very much welcomed by Southern white conservatives in New Orleans and throughout Louisiana and Texas, but of course created great controversy both among Republicans in Louisiana, but as well Republicans in Washington, D.C., especially the radical wing of the Republican Party. Andrew Johnson himself, of course, at loggerheads with the radical Republicans, saw these decisions as a welcome. Nevertheless, he could not stop from Ulysses S. Grant as head of the Army from countermanding these orders. And after much back and forth in terms of correspondence between Ulysses S. Grant and Hancock, Grant forced Hancock to countermand the orders that he had issued. Hancock, in response, desired a new command, felt his authority was being undercut by Grant, and Grant essentially moved him and sacked him in this position and moved him to Washington. So the controversy was significant. Hancock, though, at the end of the day, was hailed as a breath of fresh air amongst Democrats in the South. And this established his reputation, particularly, once again, amongst Southern white conservatives, as a Northern man who will support the Democratic Party, both in the South, but in the North as well. And once again, this is not terribly surprising in light of Hancock's politics, being born and raised a staunch Democrat, a staunch Jacksonian, someone who believed in a states' rights position on race. His military career continued in the late 1860s and 1870s. He was stationed both in the East, he was stationed in the Dakotas. In 1868 is the first time we see serious discussion amongst Democratic leaders about Hancock possibly being the nominee for president for the Democratic Party. He has strong support among many ex-veterans. And his profile, in many respects, makes him very suitable and attractive to leaders in the Democratic Party. Unlike many Democrats, he's got a very good war record, in fact, an exemplary war record. Whereas some Democratic leaders were very critical of Lincoln and the war effort, some even actively opposed the war effort. Of course, he served very well. He served with distinction. And so politically, he seems very suitable. Also, of course, in light of his actions during Reconstruction and in Louisiana, he's also very suitable and attractive to the Southern wing of the Democratic Party, which is very important. Nevertheless, in 1868, he does not get the nomination. His supporters within the party are essentially outmaneuvered. Nevertheless, his star politically is rising. Another key element, another important part of Hancock's career trajectory, and another important event that will help him politically, at least within the Democratic Party, is his ability to contend with the Great Strike of 1877. This is a strike that has its origins in a dispute with railroad workers and several important railroad companies, including the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, where these railroad companies cut worker pay 10%, sometimes more, at a time when they're making significant profits. This leads railroad workers initially, but workers in other industries as well, to go on general strike. This strike spreads from West Virginia into Pennsylvania, into Maryland, and eventually across the country. The miners, coal miners in Pennsylvania will also go on strike as well, and it spreads to other industries. The governors of these states will call out both local authorities and state militias to contend with the fact that many of these workers have taken over private property. This will lead to bloodshed and violence, sometimes significant violence. As Hancock is commander of the Eastern District, he is called upon to use federal troops to reimpose law and order in places like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and also the minefields of central Pennsylvania. And to his credit, when he uses these forces, unlike the state and local forces, violence does not occur. He uses significant force, but there is no bloodshed. And both the public, the newspapers, local leaders appreciate the fact that he uses the forces with efficiency, and that once again he imposes law and order. And this politically will be significant for him as well, because he gets this reputation as both a can-do, efficient person, but also someone who is not forced to resort to violence like certain other elements were. So he's praised both by the business community, the growing ranks of the middle class, and the media. Now, eventually, of course, this will help him in his run in 1880. The background to the 1880 election, once again, he's discussed. His strengths are significant. Now, in addition to, of course, his sterling war record, he also has now this record of being a very efficient military leader in dealing with civil unrest. His supporters leading up to the nomination, the Democratic Convention in 1880, learned a lot from his previous efforts, and particularly in 1868. They're much more sophisticated and savvy. They will not make the same mistakes they did in 1868. And the issues that are sort of in the air leading up to the election really line up for him. So, of course, he has this military record. He also has no real significant civil record that people could use against him. So one of the major questions of the day was currency, and what the currency, should it be hard currency? Should their currency be even attached to hard currency or not? This was a very divisive issue, both between the Republican and Democratic parties, but also within the Democratic Party. He does not have that. And he also has a strong base of support in the South. Once again, many of those Southern leaders remembering his work and his positions in Louisiana. While the Democrats are waiting to meet in their convention, the Republicans meet in their own convention, and in a surprise move, nominate James Garfield of Ohio, himself a one-time Union general, a congressman at one point. And the Democratic Convention will meet soon thereafter in Cincinnati. And once again, his supporters are ready. He has supporters both, of course, from Pennsylvania, but also one of his key supporters is from Louisiana, a man named Burke. And they really begin to kind of dominate the convention. There's only 2 votes. He Hancock leads the first vote, and the second vote, he gets the required 2/3 majority to win the nomination. His wife, Allie, does not seem to have been terribly enthusiastic about his running, but nevertheless, he gets the nomination. He himself will not be in Cincinnati to accept the nomination. He is still in the military. He is still a major general. He is living on Governor's Island. That's where his post is, Governor's Island in New York City. He follows the proceedings of the convention very closely via telegram with his supporters there. Upon winning the nomination, Hancock will not actively campaign. He does not leave Governor's Island to go and give speeches across the country. He will publish his acceptance letter, but he doesn't write articles. He doesn't go out and press the flesh in a traditional sort of campaign as we understand today. In fact, his campaign style is really a throwback to an earlier era where candidates would remain at home and let their supporters do most of the campaigning out for them. Some had not done this, but he's going back to that kind of position. The campaign is an interesting one because both candidates are, in certain respects, new to the sort of the national scene. Of course, people know them. They're both Union veterans. That redound to both their credits. The Republicans, when they're attacking Hancock, of course, stay away from his military record because it is such a good aspect of his background. And they focus on his lack of experience, particularly in civilian matters and civil matters. They also raised the question of the Democratic Party in general and their lack of support for a protective tariff. They argue that without a protective tariff, American industry would be hurt, and of course, American workers would be hurt. The opposition amongst Democrats to a protective tariff goes back decades. Hancock himself had not really taken a position on it, but that was a position stated in the Democratic convention plank. They also, too, resort to what they had been doing ever since the war ended, and that is what historians and scholars call waving the bloody shirt. And that is essentially stating through implication or just flat out saying it, that the Democratic Party is the party of treason. It is the party, of course, that dominates the South, that led to this Civil War, this bloody, bloody conflict. Now, of course, with Hancock, they cannot say he is a traitor because, of course, of his tremendous service in the Union Army. Rather, what they say is he will be controlled by ex-Confederates. Essentially, he'll just be a puppet of ex-Confederates in the South. So they still resort to this kind of attack, although it's not as successful with Hancock being the nomination. The Democrats respond by attacking Garfield for both his connection to various financial scandals in the Grant administration, as well as possible personal corruption, particularly with a road building deal that he had in Washington, D.C. They also argue that Garfield supports essentially open immigration from China to reduce the wages for working class people. All of these kinds of attacks have perhaps a slight grain of truth, but of course, just like the Republican attacks against the Democrats, they're hyperbolic in the extreme. The election is fascinating in the sense that it is so close. The popular vote is the closest in American history. Garfield will win the popular vote by approximately 2,000 votes, which is quite remarkable in light of the overall count. Nevertheless, his victory in the Electoral College is much more significant. He'll win 214 electoral votes to Hancock's 155. So an extremely close popular vote, a more significant electoral vote. Hancock takes the loss with great equanimity. The story goes, he's waiting in Governor's Island for the results. He is told of the results early in the morning by his wife. He's still in bed, and he rolls over and goes back to sleep. Now, what did annoy him and what might interest Pennsylvanians is he did lose his home county, which annoyed him to the extreme. In fact, he would write shortly after the election some friends back in Norristown trying to understand how this could possibly happen to this hometown hero. Nevertheless, overall, he accepted the results of the election rather well. And in fact, of course, he was still a professional member of the military. He will attend Garfield's inauguration. So once again, he puts country first in this regard over his personal interests. Now, Hancock, following this disappointment in 1880, will continue to participate in various anniversaries, commemorations. He'll serve in various charities and still have, of course, a lively public life, but he will never again run for public office, and he will still continue to serve in the U.S. military.
General Hancock died on Governor's Island, New York, on February 9th, 1886. He is currently buried at Historic Montgomery Cemetery in Norristown in a mausoleum along with his daughter Ada. His parents and brother Hilary, along with other family members, are also buried in the cemetery in Lot P. However, his wife and their son are buried with her family in St. Louis. Dr. Reed, who had saved Hancock's life after the Battle of Gettysburg by removing the bullet, is also buried at the cemetery in Lot R27.